Both LaNorris and Rocket Sanders will play crucial roles for South Carolina's football team in 2024. But which guy is more important?
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team every day. We are free and available, as always, both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as new customers can join today and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. When it comes to the potential success of South Carolina's offense in 2024, there's no doubt that that success is going to hinge on LaNorris and Rocket Sanders and their respective play on the field. But which guy is going to be more important? We're going to dive into that in just a moment. We'll also talk about where Dawn Staley ranks on the all-time women's college basketball coaches list. And at the very end of the show, we'll discuss the one thing that Lamont Paris and South Carolina's men's basketball team must do against the Ole Miss Rebels in their matchup tomorrow afternoon. We'll dive into all of that on today's edition of Locked On Gamecocks. Getting into this conversation about LaNorris and Rocket Sanders, although both of these guys are going to play a vital role for South Carolina's football team this fall, I think LaNorris is more important to this team than Rocket Sanders. And I got a couple different reasons why I think that is the case. First and foremost, I think that it is absolutely fair to say right now that Rocket Sanders is both the more experienced and the more talented player between both him and LaNorris. But LaNorris has the it factor to make up for when plays break down. That is essentially what the it factor is, in my opinion, in this particular conversation. Think about this. When a running play breaks down, unless you are a special running back, like a 1%er, and look, Rocket Sanders, again, he is a really good back. He was a first-team All-SEC back in 2022. So clearly, Sanders has talent. But unless you're a guy that can just consistently plow over defenders or juke them out of their cleats, there's not really a whole lot that you can do when plays do break down. A lot of people like to talk about how for LaNorris to be successful, he needs the O-line to protect him. But yet that same conversation, that same point does not get brought up as often when Rocket Sanders is talked about. And here's the thing about LaNorris. When a passing play breaks down, the quarterback can serve as an equalizer in today's game of football. And LaNorris is absolutely an equalizer. When you look at the athletic traits that he possesses, the speed that he has, the ability to move laterally. He also is like 6'4", 6'3", 240 plus pounds. He's a massive human being. So, he cannot just run past people, but he's going to run through defenders at certain points this next season, and he might even juke out a few defenders at certain points as well. So, when plays break down on his end, LaNorris can still make something happen. But for Rocket Sanders, and not really due to any fault of his own, when plays break down on his end, there's not going to be very much that he's going to be able to do most of the time. So that's the first reason. The second thing that I want to bring up here is the lack of proven depth behind LaNorris. This kind of dives into the question of, which guy could South Carolina afford to maybe lose due to injury if you had to say one or the other was going to get hurt. And I got to be honest, if we're going to ask that question, you got to say that you could probably afford to lose Rocket Sanders. Obviously, you don't want to lose him, but look, you look at the running back room. That room's got Oscar Attaway III from North Texas, a guy that has rushed for, I believe, at least 1,500 yards in his college career. You got a Jawarn Howell, who was a freshman All-American at the FCS level this past season. I believe he also led the MEAC in rushing yards. You've also got Juju McDowell, who's going to his 4th season of college football. You have Dontavius Braswell, who might be the fastest guy out of that entire group. And he got some valuable experience late in the season in 2023. So all 4 of those guys have playing experience. A couple of those guys have played at least 4 years of college football. You look at the quarterback room in comparison to the running back room. You have Robbie Ashford behind LaNorris Sellers. And look, I do think that Robbie Ashford can help this offense. I certainly think that you have to find a way to get him involved in some form or fashion. But if we're going to compare him and LaNorris Sellers in terms of purely throwing the football, I would say that LaNorris Sellers absolutely holds the edge there. And I would say that Robbie Ashford is a guy that, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot with in that aspect of his game. Dante Reno, as green as he can be, spring enrollee, true freshman, has not even had a practice yet with his new college team. And then you have Davis Beville, who's transferring in from Oklahoma. He played a few games here and there, never really did a whole lot much with the Sooners. So, if you were to lose LaNorris Sellers, the drop-off, in my opinion, would be quite significant compared to if you lost Rocket Sanders in a hypothetical situation. So, that's the second reason why LaNorris Sellers is more important to this team in 2024 than Rocket Sanders. The final reason, and this is the simplest reason of all, and it's why I put it last, LaNorris Sellers is the only player outside of the center who is going to touch the ball literally every single play. Falls in line with the idea of the quarterback is the most important player on the team. And sure, more often than not, you can argue that automatically, although when you have a new quarterback and a guy that's as experienced as Rocket Sanders, it is absolutely fair to have that conversation. But again, Rocket is not always going to touch the football. He's going to get his touches this fall, and he's certainly going to impact the game both in the running game and in the passing game as a receiving back, because he can do a bit of both. But Sellers is always going to have the football in his hands at some point in time. So, for all of those reasons, LaNorris Sellers is undoubtedly a more important player to this team in 2024 than Rocket Sanders is. Now, switching gears and talking about the women's basketball team. It was a big win for the Gamecocks last night over the Alabama Crimson Tide, not just in terms of the final point differential, but also because Dawn Staley earned her 600th career win as a women's college basketball head coach, and the Gamecocks also now apparently have a share of the SEC regular season title. Fair to say they will have that outright in a couple days' time when they play Kentucky, but that led me to the thought of, where does Dawn Staley rank all time compared to all the other great coaches in that sport? And so I did some research, and while I don't think she's at the very top, I think she's not far away from it. We'll dive into that conversation a little bit more in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Ibotta. Grocery bills are really, really expensive nowadays, and obviously with how much inflation has impacted food prices, it has never been more costly in the past couple decades to go and just buy food to put on your table. But now with Ibotta, your grocery bills don't have to be so expensive. You can start getting cash back on your grocery shopping with the free Ibotta app and get cash back every time you shop. The average Ibotta user earns $256 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, or 2 or 3. It could also buy a flight that maybe you've been eyeballing, a game that you've been dying to go to, or the fancy dinner that you have been craving for. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKEDONCollege when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app to start earning cash back and use code LOCKEDONCollege. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store and use code LOCKEDONCollege. Welcome back to this Friday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. Now, Dawn Staley, I think it is fair to say, and it's certainly not rocket science to say this, she is already one of the greatest coaches in women's college basketball history. But, in my personal opinion, she still has a bit more to do if she wants to be on the quote-unquote Mount Rushmore, essentially in the top 4 group in the sports history. Now, in terms of where I think Dawn Staley personally ranks right now, I would put Dawn Staley 6th. Now, ahead of her, currently on the Mount Rushmore, I have UConn's Geno Auriemma. I have the late, great Pat Summitt from Tennessee. I have Stanford head coach Tara Vanderveer, and I have current LSU head coach Kim Mulkey. They round out the top 4 right now, in my opinion. And then, after those 4, I think Notre Dame's Muffin McGraw, who is now retired, is 5th on the list, and I think Dawn Staley ranks right behind her at number 6. Now, the difference right now between Dawn Staley and a lot of the coaches that are ahead of her, quite frankly, is national championships. Pat Summitt and Geno Auriemma, they both have 8 and 11 respectively with how I just listed them. And I gotta be honest, unless Dawn Staley decides that she's going to do this for another 15, 20 years, I don't quite know if she's going to ever reach that number or either of those numbers in terms of national titles. I could certainly see her getting close, but I don't know if she's ever going to even tie Pat Summitt there. Now, Tara Vanderveer has 3 national titles, but she also has the all-time wins record in basketball history at the college level. Period. End of story. So that's why I put her 3rd. Kim Mulkey has 4 national titles, along with 5 Final Four appearances, which happens to be tied, by the way, with Dawn Staley, in terms of the Final Four appearances, that is. Muffin McGraw, she has 2 national titles, just like Dawn Staley, but she has been to the Final Four 9 times, and she's also won 15 regular season conference titles. Dawn, with last night's regular season title clincher, now has 11 on her resume in total. So what does Dawn have to do? Well, without making this overly complex, simply put, she's got to win more national championships. So then the next question is this: how many does she have to win to get on that Mount Rushmore? I would say that Dawn Staley's got to win 3 more. I think Dawn Staley's got to get to 5 national titles in order to get on the Mount Rushmore. Again, don't think she's going to ever get to Geno or Pat Summitt. I certainly think she can surpass Tara Vanderveer. I certainly think that she can even surpass Kim Mulkey. Now, it might sound a bit crazy to say that. Mulkey, look, I know that Gamecock fans are going to have their opinions on Kim Mulkey, especially concerning the fact that she coaches probably their biggest rival in the conference right now in the LSU Tigers. But you got to give Kim Mulkey props where it's deserved. I mean, she's been a very, very successful head coach at Baylor and now at LSU. And she could have another national title or 2, to win before her career's all said and done. But I have to admit right now, with the way that Dawn Staley and this team is rolling, I think that if Kim Mulkey is going to win more titles with LSU, it would have to be through Dawn Staley and this team slipping up more often than not. And that's not going to happen very often. I just don't see it. So I think that for Dawn, get 3 more. You'll get 5 national titles. Let's say Kim Mulkey manages to get another national title. You still tie Kim Mulkey. And also, you're both currently tied in Final Four appearances. I 1000% think that Dawn Staley can surpass Kim Mulkey and build a cushion in that regard. And then with Muffin McGraw, again, Muffin McGraw, great coach, Hall of Fame coach. I believe she's in the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame as well. Dawn Staley, she's not finishing her career with 2 national titles. Unless she doesn't win it this year and then suddenly announces her retirement in the offseason. I don't think that's going to happen, obviously. So, in terms of how high can Dawn Staley go on the all-time list, I think Dawn Staley can go up as high as 3. As long as Tara Vanderveer's got those 3 national titles and the all-time wins record, I'm not going to put very many people ahead of her. Now, if Dawn and or Kim both win 5 national titles, then Tara Vanderveer will get supplanted by both of them because, again, the all-time wins record, that is certainly a massive accomplishment, and she deserves a lot of credit for it, but national titles have got to count for something here. And if Dawn Staley has won 5 and Tara Vanderveer stays at 3 for the rest of her career, then having 2 more than Vanderveer, that's got to count for something. So, long story short, I don't think that Dawn Staley's on the Mount Rushmore right now in terms of all-time greats in the women's basketball coaching fraternity and sorority, co-ed. You get my point. But if Dawn Staley wins a few more rings, 1,000% she is on the Mount Rushmore as far as the greatest coaches in women's college basketball history. Now, Lamont Paris and the men's basketball team, they haven't played since their debacle this past Saturday against the LSU Tigers. They got what, in my opinion, I think in the opinion of many, was a much-needed bye week this week. But tomorrow, they do have a very intriguing game on the road in Oxford as they'll be taking on the Ole Miss Rebels, a team that gave South Carolina a run for their money a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and probably could have been the team to upset South Carolina by coming back late if a couple plays went the other way. So what does South Carolina have to do this time against Ole Miss in order to win maybe more comfortably and not be sweating bullets at the very end of this ball game? I'll dive into that in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. We got an interesting game taking place later tonight as the Los Angeles Clippers will go on the road again to take on the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, the Grizzlies are 9-point underdogs, been going through a very rough season, a lot of injuries, and the Clippers are considered right now an NBA Finals contender. But the Grizzlies have won each of their past 2 games, one of those games being against the Milwaukee Bucks, and this will be their first game coming off of the All-Star break. And obviously, you got Gigi Jackson on that squad, and Gigi has been playing phenomenal as of late. So with Memphis, the young guys that they have, and the way that I believe Taylor Jenkins is his name, their head coach, the way he's been coaching them up, who knows? The Grizzlies could indeed cover that spread. So if you're interested in maybe betting on that spread line or looking at any other games and or players, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot right now with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Okay, the last time that South Carolina played Ole Miss, the game came down to one final stop for the Gamecocks, as Matthew Morrell put up a 3-point shot at the final buzzer. Jacoby Wright, I believe, was the defender. Chris Beard, after that game, said he thought that there was contact. It seemed like that he wanted a foul to be called. South Carolina, in a way, they kind of escaped against Ole Miss. And that was one of those games where South Carolina, they had a pretty solid lead. With 15:29 left in the game, the Gamecocks were up 14 points. And then Ole Miss put 7'5" center Jamarian Sharp out there on the floor for the rest of the matchup. And the Gamecocks wound up only scoring 15 points the rest of the way. So the one thing that South Carolina has got to do against Ole Miss tomorrow afternoon, I mean, obviously they got to accomplish a bevy of things. But one thing I think is a must. South Carolina has got to figure out how to score on offense when Jamarian Sharp is on the floor. Because here's what happened in a very general sense when they played last time. When Jamarian Sharp was on the floor in the second half, South Carolina, their offense bogged down completely. Now, part of this was due to the fact that Ole Miss, they did play some good defense. They had some good possessions late in the game when they needed them. But the main thing was this. When you're facing a 7'5" center, and he is just sitting there basically right at the rim, probably committing multiple 3-second violations that never get called anymore by officials, but nonetheless, He's standing right there in the paint area. You're not going to drive to the basket. You're going to be persuaded to do something else. And so what South Carolina started to do was they started to play a lot more individual-based basketball. They started just throwing up a lot more shots that, quite frankly, were not clean looks. They weren't efficient looks. They weren't off of good passes. And that was how very quickly South Carolina saw their lead dwindle down to pretty much nothing over the course of 7 or 8 minutes in that second half. So, when you have a 7'5" center that's sitting there at the rim, and you can't maybe find open three-point shots, what do you have to do to combat that? Well, the answer is pretty simple, but it's an answer we don't see many teams try to achieve anymore in basketball. You have to find a way to score in the mid-range area. You simply have to. Most basketball teams, I'm not trying to pick on South Carolina. Okay, I'll make that clear real quick. A lot of basketball teams operate like this now. You're either looking for a three-pointer or you're driving straight to the basket. You'll try to drive to the basket and kick it out for a perimeter shot. That's basically where the majority of teams take their shot attempts now. The mid-range shot, I don't want to say it's obsolete now in the sport, but it's pretty close to it. Most teams kind of stray away from it now. But for South Carolina, when Jamarian Sharp gets put in the game for Ole Miss, you've got to find a way to score differently. You can't just drive right at him. He's going to block you. And South Carolina, look, I'll be honest, outside of maybe a Meechie Johnson, they don't really have anybody on this team that can just all of a sudden get the ball and just fire it up when they want to and hit a three. Miles Studi, you can probably throw into that category as well, but outside of those two, really don't see anybody on this team that can do that consistently. So, a few guys in this game have got to make it a point to attack the mid-range area to a certain degree when Jamarian Sharp is out there. And the three guys I'm really looking at here to accomplish that are Talon Cooper, Jacoby Wright, and Meechie Johnson. I think those are your three guys that can absolutely do that. You don't want to pull BJ Mack out away and have him shooting mid-range shots because BJ is basically your center when he's out there on the floor. He has kind of the most girth out of the front court. So if Sharp's out there and Mack's out there along with Kyle Murray Boyles, he's going to be playing the 5. So you don't want to take him away because that is one of your better rebounding threats in the paint area, offensively speaking. So your guards have got to lead the charge here. Talon Cooper, he can be quite crafty when he wants to. Yes, he is a pass-first guard for the most part. He is a facilitator, but Talon Cooper, he's got some moves in his bag that he just doesn't unleash very often, and so it kind of gets forgotten about. Jacoby Wright. I've said this before on social media during basketball games. I will say it here now. In my opinion, the best shot in Jacoby Wright's arsenal is a pull-up mid-range jumper from about 15 feet out from the basket. Jacoby Wright, for whatever reason, it is just a really good shot for him. And yet, we just don't see that a whole lot from him in these games. Meechie Johnson, same sort of deal. Now, Meechie, the thing that's different between him and Cooper and Wright is Meechie is by far the most explosive out of the three. Obviously, Meechie is either going to hoist up a 35-foot three-point shot, or he is going to try to go downhill, drive past his man, and then put the defense in conflict. But Meechie has also shown over the past week or two that he's also got a mid-range jumper as well. He is a shooter. He is a guy that can knock down shots from pretty much anywhere. So, when Jamarian Sharp is out there on the floor, and he's going to sit there and he's just going to hope that all these guards are just going to come running at him, and he can just stick his hand down, he's going to swat the ball down, make him look silly, put a highlight on ESPN, and he's going to have like 5-6 blocks. Don't fall into that trap if you're South Carolina. If he's out there on the floor, you need to attack the mid-range area more tomorrow. You simply are going to have to. Because if you don't, then you can probably lose this game. I mean, you can absolutely lose this game, even that withstanding. But you can't do what you did last time. You can't sit around the perimeter and just try to hoist up threes. That's great when the ball is moving and when bodies are moving. But when nobody's moving and the ball's sitting in one area before getting hoisted up, at that point now, the quality of the shot is not that good. It just isn't. So you got to keep movement going on the offensive end. They were bad about this in a couple of other games, and obviously it caught up to them against LSU, so I'm sure they've gone back to the drawing board in certain aspects to remind themselves of things that they got to do better if they want to ensure they don't lose games like that anymore. South Carolina can absolutely win this game, but they've got to attack the Rebels in a very smart fashion on offense when Jermaine Sharp, 7'5", is out there on the floor. Have to do that tomorrow if you want to beat the Rebels on their floor. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show. As always, who do y'all think is more important to the football team in 2024, LaNorris Sellers or Rocket Sanders? Where do you think Dawn Staley ranks on the all-time list for women's college basketball coaches? Do you think she's on the Mount Rushmore, or do you think she still has a ways to go before she gets there? And lastly, what's the one thing you think the men's basketball team must do in order to defeat Ole Miss on Saturday afternoon? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you could shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. But as always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Friday and a fantastic weekend. And I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.